Welcome to the Non-Diet Yogi podcast. This is episode 32 and it is called Nourishing Your Pre-Ovulatory Phase, which is part 2 of my series on Moontime nutrition. If you are interested in going back to part 1, I will be giving a much more thorough introduction to what this is all about in part 1. So go back to episode 31 if you want that. Basically, let's get into part 2, the pre-ovulatory phase. I should probably mention, my name is Casey. I'm a non-diet dietitian, a holistic nutritionist, yoga teacher, and strength coach. I'm also in my final year of studying to be a naturopath, which is very exciting. A few little things before we dive right in. I would love it if you found me on Instagram. I am pretty crap at Instagram. I do have an account for the Non-Diet Yogi. It's at Non-Diet Yogi. But my primary account is my business name, funky.forest.health. And I have been locked out of old accounts. I've had them crash. I've had them hacked. Usually something stupid happens, or I try to add a business app and it shits itself or something like that. So I would love it if you could support me by on Instagram going to at funky.forest.health, giving me a big fat love heart, maybe also checking out at Non-Diet Yogi for this podcast. You can also support us by leaving a cracking review on Apple iTunes or wherever you're listening to this, and or you could visit our patreon.com/non-diet-yogi website, where for just $2 a month you get a veritable crap ton of bonuses now that library is building, bonus audios from past guests, a bunch of bonus episodes that I do exclusively for Patreons, and a special gift just to complement the release of this episode. So the Patreon bonus that accompanies this episode is a condensed chart of what I actually now realize are the 5 phases of the menstrual cycle, not 4 as I initially mentioned in my last podcast, episode 31. So it's a condensed chart of the 5 phases of the menstrual cycle with a little bit more than the nutrition stuff that I go into here. So I also go into the characteristic physiological stuff and the energetics, the initiations and the basic archetypes of each phase. So this is stuff that I don't talk about in the podcast, or at least I haven't yet. Maybe I'll create another bonus episode if uni doesn't eat me alive first and I have time to do that. But basically, this is a pretty special gift that I basically shared this chart over 7 years ago when I started really delving into this work. But I've got to say my understanding has vastly expanded since that time. So I have reflected this new depth of understanding in the chart that I am sharing with the Non-Diet Yogi podcast Patreons. Again, that's at patreon.com/non-diet-yogi if you want to find that. This chart's very special to me. It's work in a really neat summary that I've been studying and teaching for many years. I have learnt about this stuff from many teachers and read many books, but I have put together my own take on it as kind of determined by my own lived experience, from a stance of body trust. I guess it's a quite a feminist approach, and also just being a woman in my mid to late 30s and being a mother. I have added a few things you might find interesting there. I do bring in the traditional Chinese medicine, kind of Ayurvedic, elemental side of things in that chart, as well as add some psycho-spiritual and archetypal aspects of the various phases of the hormonal cycle. But it's in a very concise 1-page chart that you can stick on your fridge, and that is for my beloved Patreons who make this podcast possible. So if you want to check that out, as well as all the other cool stuff that's there, please go to patreon.com/non-diet-yogi. All right, let's get into today's episode, nourishing your pre-ovulatory phase. So as I've mentioned in episode 31, the cyclical nature of the menstrual cycle communicates really beautifully our constantly changing needs, and the benefits of paying attention to those phases and to those needs are enormous. And in this series that I'm producing, you may hear that I've got a little bit of a blocked nose, so I'm producing it nonetheless. In this series, we will explore the different phases of the menstrual cycle and how best to honor them, mainly through nutrition, herbs, and a few lifestyle kind of things you can do. But as I mentioned, I do go into a bit more of the spiritual depth in my bonus. Okay. So, phase 2, the pre-ovulatory phase. And by the way, I'm going to be talking a lot about hormones and rises and falls and fluctuations in different hormones at different stages of the cycle. If you want a visual of all this stuff, go to the blog post I've written that accompanies this episode. It's at funkyforest.com.au/blog, and there you should find, or you could type into the search box, Moontime Nutrition Part 2, Nourishing Your Pre-Ovulatory Phase, or Moontime Nutrition, or Pre-Ovulatory Phase, or something along those lines, and you should find it. So, the pre-ovulatory phase generally starts from the end of menstrual bleeding until a few days before ovulation. In a typical 28-day cycle, this approximately corresponds to day 6 until day 11 of the cycle. So I'm speaking about my own cycle there. I happen to have a 28-day cycle, and for me, the pre-ovulatory phase generally goes from day 6, because I finished bleeding on day 5 or 6, until day 11. If your cycle is, say, 30 days long, this phase might more closely correspond with, days 7 to day 12 or something like that. And similarly, if your cycle is shorter, so, give or take. Similar to an inner spring or the waxing moon phase of the lunar cycle, this phase has traditionally been seen as a time of dynamism, of rising energy levels and growing confidence. Just speaking for myself, I personally feel quite a sense of renewal, as if the fresh breezes of spring are flowing through my consciousness at this stage. It's really quite a wonderful stage. I like it. After you have a period, basically, you begin to grow a bunch of new eggs, or follicles is what they're technically called, and that will happen inside one of your ovaries. Not both, just one. I shouldn't say you, but I tend to enter this energetic cycle of inspiration and creation, physically, psychologically, and, dare I say, spiritually. This phase is ideal for giving birth to something kind of outside yourself. And that correlates with, I think, the fact that internally in your body, one of your ovaries is beginning to gestate and eventually birth a fertile egg, or ovum is what it's called when one of the follicles matures. I really love getting into the energetic and archetypal aspects of the hormonal cycle, but I also think it's really important that we get grounded and cover some basic physiology so that you get a pretty good idea of what's happening inside your physical body during this phase. So first, some physiology. If you are like me, a fellow nerd, you really geek out on the science behind things and knowing, the hormones and what they're called, this bit's for you. If not, you could probably fast forward to the next bit, where I start talking about the actual nutritional things that you can do for this phase. But bear with me because I think this is interesting. So the pre-ovulatory phase is really part of what is referred to by physiologists, so scientists who study how the human body functions. This is really part of the follicular phase. And if you open a physiology textbook or check out research papers on this, they will generally break down the menstrual cycle into two main parts, follicular and luteal. The follicular phase technically spans from day 1, the first day of bleeding, up until ovulation, which takes place around day 14 in a 28-day cycle. The luteal phase is everything after ovulation, so from day 15 to day 28. And the entire cycle begins again on day 1 with the commencement of menses. I further differentiate these two phases. In fact, I believe there are 5 distinct phases of the menstrual cycle. Other authors, other teachers will break the cycle down into 4 phases. And if you jump onto my blog that I mentioned at funkyforest.com.au/blog, you will be able to see the graph that I put there that shows, one of these traditional breakdowns into 4 phases. So in the chart that I've got on my blog, I've got the menstrual, follicular, luteal, and premenstrual phases with ovulation smack bang in the middle. Other people will call it the menstrual, follicular, ovulation, and luteal phase. Some people say menstrual, pre-ovulatory, ovulatory, and premenstrual phase. I think that last one is getting closer to what it actually is. But I don't think any of those breakdowns into 4 phases, I don't think any of them delineate clearly enough the unique phases of the cycle, which is why I personally like to break the cycle down into 5 parts, but more on that in future episodes. Let's stay with the pre-ovulatory phase for now. So in this phase, your hormonal profile moves away from the flatlining of the menstrual phase, refer to episode 31 if you want to hear more about that, and towards a much more dynamic hormonal picture. So there's a heap of stuff going on here. Basically, your hypothalamus, which is a little gland in your brain, produces gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, also known as GnRH, in response to low estrogen levels. So remember, when you're when you are menstruating, estrogen levels as well as progesterone levels drop right down and they have that flatlining effect. So when that happens, your hypothalamus goes beep, 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 I'm detecting low estrogen. I am going to produce and release gonadotrophin releasing hormone. Gonadotrophin releasing hormone will then tell the pituitary gland, also in your head, to produce follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH. So FSH is the hormone responsible for kind of kick-starting follicle or egg development in the ovaries. As FSH rises, multiple egg follicles will begin to swell, although only one will eventually ripen to full maturity. FSH also increases the production of estrogen by the ovaries, and this rising estrogen starts to thicken the uterine lining to support the anticipated implantation of the egg, or ovum as it's technically called. This rise in estrogen begins to inhibit the secretion of FSH. The fall in FSH that then happens allows the smaller follicles to die off, and the dominant follicle continues to grow. LH, remember that other hormone produced by your pituitary gland, luteinizing hormone, LH, aids in egg maturation and provides the hormonal trigger to cause ovulation. So it's the one that goes, okay, egg is mature, send it out of the ovary, which, that's what makes the dominant follicle, I should say, move out of the ovary and into the fallopian tubes. So throughout all of this, estrogen is basically rising quite sharply. It goes higher than at any other point during the cycle, especially as we get towards ovulation. Meanwhile, progesterone stays fairly low during this phase. Sorry, I just had to go blow my nose. I'm recovering from this cold and I don't want to spend too much time editing this episode because it is getting close to 8 p.m. and I want to watch The Handmaid's Tale tonight on SBS. So I'm going to try to get this finished, and it might not be perfect, but oh well. So the entire purpose of this complicated symphony of hormones is very singular, and that is to ovulate. In other words, to release a single mature egg or ovum into the fallopian tube that can then potentially be fertilized by a sperm. So with this in mind, let's now touch on those nutritional tips for nourishing your body during your dynamic pre-ovulatory phase. The first of my tips is fuel your workouts adequately. So again, if you jump on the blog, you will see in that chart that there is a lot happening in this phase. Estrogen is basically rising the whole time, but initially in the pre-ovulatory phase, it is not super high. It only gets crack-a-lackin' and kind of reaches a crescendo in the last day or two of the pre-ovulatory phase, so not long before ovulation, which is phase 3, by the way. The first part of the pre-ovulatory phase is a relatively low hormone phase, and that follows on from the flatlining of both estrogen and progesterone in the menstrual phase. See episode 31. In the early pre-ovulatory phase, so I'm talking about maybe day 6 until 9 or something, in that first part, our bodies are really quite resilient to stress, similar to how we were in the menstrual phase. It's at this time that you may feel your energy continue to rise. Yay! So high intensity workouts, runs with hills in them, if you're that kind of person, and heavier resistance or weight training are all on the cards. But we just need to remember to recover well. And here is where I will emphasize the importance of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate. Those of you who know my work well will know just how much I love carbs, and maybe equally just how much I hate low carb diet fads. Well, any diet fad, to be honest. Carbs are incredibly important for fueling literally everything that we do. So carbohydrate, the fuel for everything we do, can be kind of grabbed from a few different places in the body to then be broken down into energy for cells to use. It can be pulled straight from the blood if we've got blood glucose kind of hanging out not long after eating and breaking it down in our gut. Or carbohydrate can come from our short-term energy stores, which is also known as glycogen. And glycogen, basically all that is are just longer chains of glucose, and you will find glycogen in your liver and in your muscles. Since you may be more inclined to work out harder in your pre-ovulatory phase because you have that rising energy, because you're no longer bleeding, because you might feel pretty damn good, it's important to fuel any workouts really well to get the most out of them and to ensure that you build your body up rather than breaking or tearing it down. So ideally, you'd include both carbs, and protein and stuff as well. But basically, you'd include carbs in both your pre-workout meal and after your workout session. So I'll talk about pre-workout. Basically, ideally, you would plan for a main meal 2 to 3 hours before any kind of moderate to intense workout. And ideally, that meal would contain around 50% slow-burning carbohydrate, so things like oats, whole grain toast, lentils, rice, brown, white, whatever you like, quinoa, potato, sweet potato, and the remaining 50% would be divided between protein, some healthy fat sources, and vegetables or salady things. FYI, a big bowl of salad is not a solid meal, and it is certainly not a sufficient pre-workout meal. I'll say that again. A big bowl of salad is not a proper meal. I see so many women just eating a salad for lunch, and it's just like, oh, no, your body is going to not like that. You are not getting enough energy to do very much at all. Anyway, I won't go down that rabbit hole. Back to the pre-workout meal. So if you happen to work out, at 4 p.m., that will work really nicely to have that main meal 2 to 3 hours before you work out. However, if you are the kind of person to work out first thing in the morning, you don't have 2 to 3 hours to wait around for that carbohydrate heavier meal to digest. So I recommend eating a solid dinner the night before that contains a good hit of slow release carbs alongside your protein and your fat and your veggies. And if your morning workout or any workout is at a moderate to intense pace for more than, say, 45 minutes, so it's more than a flow yoga class, or it's not just a yin yoga class where you're pretty much lying on the floor the whole time. I love yin yoga, but let's face it, it's not really that intense. So if your workout is something more high intensity or heavy weightlifting, I would definitely also have a little snack. If it's in the morning, I'd have a little snack with some carbohydrates soon after waking if you aren't having breakfast beforehand. So something like honey and peanut butter on a piece of toast, or an apple with a tablespoon of almond or peanut butter, just something you can quickly grab as you're heading out the door if you're going to the gym. Your performance in the morning will be better for it. Your body will love you instead of being cranky with you. Tip number 2, prioritize post-workout recovery. Did I mention including carbs both pre-workout and after a session? Yes, I did. So let's talk now about post-workout. Ideally, you try to have a post-workout snack within about 30 minutes of finishing your training session. And you need both carbs and protein in this to really help replenish fuel stores and repair micro damage to muscles so that the muscles can actually get stronger and bigger and you can actually get those gains that everyone, kind of talks about. I hate talking like that, but, if you're looking for strength gains or even hypertrophy, ideally, you need a post-workout snack. Try not to be one of those people who grabs a protein shake and forgets about the carbs. In the low hormone phase, we can access stored carbohydrates, so the stuff in our liver and muscles, pretty well. So in recovery, consider increasing your carb intake to really help restore glycogen in your muscles and liver. A ratio of around 3-to-1 carbohydrate to protein should hit the mark. Some post-workout snack ideas are things like a smoothie based on yogurt with banana or fruit of some kind and pumpkin seeds, so you're getting carbs, protein and fat there. Some pita bread with hummus and or a hard-boiled egg, same thing, carbs, protein, fat. Some peanut butter on toast. You can see a repeating pattern here, and perhaps can see I really like peanut butter on toast with honey and cinnamon if you want to go crazy. What else? A handful of nuts and a piece of fruit. All of these are some lovely post-workout snack ideas. As your body gets closer to ovulation, estrogen rises sharply and reaches a peak whilst progesterone remains pretty low. When it's unopposed by progesterone like this, estrogen is anabolic, meaning it builds tissues up. So with that estrogen surge that happens just before ovulation, you may still feel really great doing high intensity, heavy resistance training. If that is the case, do keep fueling your workouts as I've described. So again, you can get those gains and keep feeling on top of the world without, creating too much stress and strain and tiredness in your body. Tip number 3, modulate hormones with phytoestrogens. So take a big breath because this next bit can be a little bit of a lot to take in. We're going to talk about estrogen, baby. Estrogen. Estrogen has a huge impact on reproductive health, but that's not the only way it affects the body. It also impacts the urinary tract, the cardiovascular system, the bones, the muscles, the mucous membranes, your hair, nails, and skin, and your brain. There are actually 3 kinds of estrogen. We've got estradiol, the most common type produced during the reproductive years, estriol, which is produced during pregnancy, and estrone or estrone, which is produced generally after menopause, although in some disease states such as PCOS, there can be a lot of conversion of androgens actually to estrone. But in this article, just for simplicity's sake, I'll focus on estradiol. I'll just use the word estrogen, okay, to keep it simple as much as possible. As I was talking about before, within the dynamic hormonal dance of this phase, the pre-ovulatory phase, estrogen plays a number of important roles. Firstly, it thickens the uterine lining to support the anticipated implantation of an egg. And secondly, it ensures that the smaller maturing follicles die off so that one single dominant follicle can eventually be released. This is ovulation. I always think of the Lord of the Rings theme song when I think of the one ring to rule them all. I think of the one follicle to rule them all, the one that matures and ripens to be the chosen one. That's the one that gets ovulated. Okay, moving on. So I'm going to talk now about estrogen imbalances. So basically, modern women experience a much higher lifetime exposure to estrogen than did our grandmothers and our forebearers. This is mostly due to fewer pregnancies, decreased breastfeeding, an earlier age of menarche, and a later age of menopause. So menarche is the very first time you have a period. That happening earlier, menopause happening later, and all of this leading to a greater number of menstrual cycles and therefore more estrogen exposure over our lifetimes. Today, we're also dealing with a higher load of environmental estrogens than ever before. These xenoestrogens are endocrine disruptors, and they're present throughout our entire lives, not just our menstruating years. They come from beauty products, laundry products, cleaning products, pesticides, herbicides, insecticides, plastics in foods and in drinks and in storage containers, as well as non-food packaging, kind of industrial plastics. They come from receipts, from air fresheners. The list goes on and on and on. I don't want to make this an episode about fear-mongering regarding xenoestrogens, but for these reasons I've mentioned, estrogen imbalances, often of the excess estrogen kind, are becoming more common than ever. Estrogen levels can basically be too high and contribute to certain disease states. But estrogen levels can also be too low, leading to a failure to ovulate. These excesses or deficiencies of estrogen can be absolute or relative. I won't go into that too much. How is this relevant? So it is hypothesized, there is a theory, that severe symptoms of premenstrual syndrome or PMS arise at least partly due to an estrogen excess relative to progesterone. So this is where having too much estrogen floating around can make PMS worse. There are also certain disease states. So endometriosis is a condition partly characterized by estrogen dominance. It's also an immune-related inflammatory condition. But in terms of the estrogen dominance, it's where levels are too high relative to progesterone. And although balanced levels of estrogen are obviously super important and healthy, too high levels of estrogen can trigger inflammation and symptoms like severe pain, which is what happens in endometriosis and with uterine fibroids, by the way. Polycystic ovarian syndrome, or PCOS, is another condition in which people can experience symptoms of excess estrogen relative to progesterone. It's a bit different with PCOS. The type of estrogen that builds up is estrone or estrone, and my understanding is that is different to the type that's high in endometriosis. I think that is more an estradiol type dominance. And with PCOS, the estrone dominance or estrone buildup has a lot to do with the excess production of androgens, or what's seen as male sex hormones in that particular disease state, which then it prevents ovulation. So people with PCOS will have irregular menstrual cycles, or they might not have periods at all. The androgens will block periods altogether. Finally, there are conditions in which estrogen levels are too low. So in both hypothalamic amenorrhea, or HA, and premature ovarian insufficiency, levels of estrogen are too low for the body to ovulate, and sometimes progesterone can be too low as well, which leads to shorter periods. Disordered eating and excessive exercise can lead to reduced ovarian stimulation and problems with fertility, such as HA and premature ovarian insufficiency. HA I have personally experienced and recovered from. I have lots more information on hypothalamic amenorrhea on my blog. If you go to the Nourishing Your Pre-Ovulatory Phase blog on my website, funkypross.com.au/blog, you will find all the links to those articles on HA if that is your jam. But you know what? Even if you don't have any of the aforementioned so-called hormonal imbalances, given that we're basically swimming in so much more estrogen than ever before, modulating estrogen levels can really optimize your well-being and your comfort. And I say comfort because the higher, very high estrogen levels leading up to ovulation, and similarly in the premenstrual phase, but maybe not to as great a degree, these high levels of estrogen can make you more prone to vaginal thrush and kind of general itchiness in that area. As you can see, the pre-ovulatory phase is such a crucial time for estrogen. Of course, estrogen is just one moving part within this wonderfully complex system involving continuous communication between the brain centers and the ovaries along that hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis, the HPO axis. However, we can really support the body in modulating levels of estrogen so that this cascade of events really takes place smoothly, culminating with that final goal of healthy ovulation. Okay, this is where phytoestrogens come in. So phytoestrogens are bioactive plant molecules that are similar in chemical structure to human estrogen. This means they can bind with estrogen receptors in the body. However, they are up to 400 times smaller than endogenous estrogens, so those which are made by the body. And so they're much weaker in their biological activity and effects. Here's the cool thing. When phytoestrogens bind to estrogen receptors in your body, they can induce either an estrogenic or an anti-estrogenic response in your tissues, depending on what is needed. This dual action of phytoestrogen, so it can either reduce low estrogen symptoms in women with estrogen deficiency, and it can also reduce excessive estrogen stimulation in women with estrogen excess, so something like endometriosis. This dual action is referred to by herbalists as amphoterism. This seemingly paradoxical action makes phytoestrogenic foods and herbs really useful to people experiencing estrogen-dominant conditions like endometriosis and uterine fibroids, as well as to folks dealing with estrogen-deficient conditions such as hypothalamic amenorrhea, which is a relative estrogen deficiency, as well as menopause, which is an absolute estrogen deficiency. And the fancy pants way of describing this amazing property of phytoestrogens is selective estrogen receptor modulators, or SERMs, if we're using the American way of spelling estrogen. So where do you find phytoestrogens? Well, they're present in many foods, including fruits, so things like plums, pears, apples, grapes, and berries. They're in veggies like beans, sprouts, cabbage, carrots, spinach, garlic, and onion. They're in walnuts, they're in legumes, they're in tea. And there are a number of types of phytoestrogen molecules. So the main ones that you'll come across are probably lignans and isoflavones. So lignans are phytoestrogens found in fruits like apples and berries, found in whole grains like barley, wheat, oats, and rice, and in seeds, sesame seeds, flax seeds, and stuff. Isoflavones are the phytoestrogens found in soy products like tempeh, tofu, edamame, natto, and miso, as well as in other legumes like mung beans, lentils, and peas. If you're eating a mostly whole food based diet, you're probably getting plenty of phytoestrogens in the foods you eat every day already. However, some foods have more phytoestrogenic effects than others. Flaxseed, for instance, contains the highest total phytoestrogen content, followed by soybeans and tofu. By the way, I have references for all this stuff. I'm not just pulling this information out of my ass. If you want to see the references, go to the blog, funkyforest.com.au/blog. So those foods containing phytoestrogens, such as tofu and tempeh, can be really awesome modulators that women experiencing infertility, they're so good that these women who are experiencing infertility have been shown to significantly benefit from consumption of phytoestrogens during their infertility treatment. Because so many foods contain phytoestrogens, I think that if you're looking to optimize your estrogen levels, it's a safe bet to regularly include these foods. So we've got sauerkraut and kimchi, plenty of fruit and veg, sprouted beans and seeds, whole grains, and fermented soy foods such as tempeh, miso, and natto. A number of herbal medicines also contain naturally occurring phytoestrogens, so things like hops, Humulus lupulus, red clover. I won't say all the scientific names. They're on my blog if you want to see and you're a herb nerd. Sage, alfalfa, and licorice, including those kinds of culinary herbs. So like sage in your meal with your spaghetti bolognese, and enjoying teas containing licorice. I like tea containing licorice, just as a side note. Those are just other ways to modulate the levels of estrogen in your body. Beyond culinary use, I would consult a qualified herbalist or naturopath for ideal doses of herbs, since herbal medicines are very complex and dosage really needs to be individualized to your needs. So if you're going beyond teas and sprinkling herbs in your pasta, please see a qualified naturopath or herbalist. Side note, just for those who are experiencing hypothalamic amenorrhea, please know that eating more phytoestrogenic foods probably will not be enough to make your period come back. Just saying that as a disclaimer. This is because HA is caused by stress. The stress of not eating enough, of excessive exercise, and or stressful psychological experiences. In HA, there is low estrogen, but this is a downstream effect. The root cause is stress, which it actually impairs the pulsatile release of gonadotrophin-releasing hormone. We mentioned that one before. An abnormal gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, or GnRH secretion, causes a reduction in the pulses of both LH and FSH. And without those, the follicles won't develop properly, and therefore you don't get ovulation. So remember, no follicles and no ovulation means low or no estrogen. Instead of going to town on soy, if this is you, I would focus on overall nutritional and caloric adequacy and dialing back exercise, perhaps dialing it way back. Moving on. Oh my God, this is a big one. Number 4, support phase 2 liver detoxification. No, I'm not talking about dumb 5-day juice fast or skinny tea promoted by a Kardashian. I'm referring to the role that the liver has in the metabolism and clearance of estrogen. And yes, I'm going to keep talking about estrogen. So you will probably notice that naturopaths in particular talk a lot about the liver and about keeping it happy and healthy. Healthy liver function is essential for detoxification and clearance of estrogen in the body. It's actually involved in the metabolism and excretion of all hormones. Please note, I am not using the word detoxification in the way that it has been co-opted by the wellness industry to fuel a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Vomit, basically. I'm using the word detoxification as a synonym for metabolism, as a physiological term. In fact, wouldn't it be nice if it was just called liver metabolism instead of liver detoxification? I just find that would be way less triggering to those of us who have experienced diet culture fuckedness, but I don't make the rules. In all the physiology textbooks, it's called liver detoxification. So, what is detoxification actually? Detoxification is a metabolic process by which toxins are changed into less toxic or more readily excretable substances. It involves the whole body, so the liver plays a big role, but so do the lungs, the skin, the kidneys, the urinary system, the digestive system, and the lymphatic system. If you really want to deep dive into detoxification, what it actually is and how it differs from the bullshit wellness industry definition of it, I have a whole article online. Again, it's at my blog. And if you in the search bar, look for detoxification, so much more than cleansers and colonics or something like that. And I will go into it there. But let's go back to detoxification just generally. What is a toxin, you might ask? Okay. Basically, a toxin is a poisonous substance that's either made in the body, endogenous, that's what it's called if it's made in the body, or is introduced into the body. In other words, exogenous. So exogenous toxins come from outside the body. They're things we voluntarily ingest, things like alcohol, cigarette smoke, recreational drugs, over-the-counter medications, food additives, preservatives. Then there are environmental toxins, so heavy metals, pesticides, mold. Yay, mold. Not. I hate mold. It initiated asthma in me after 30 years of not having it because I lived in a moldy kind of area. Anyway, staying on track, let's talk about endogenous toxins. So they include digestive byproducts leading to the overgrowth of certain bacteria, viruses, fungi, and parasites. It might also include homocysteine and certain hormones which can become toxic if levels get too high in the body, looking at you, estrogen. Then there are also free radicals, which are a natural part of chemical reactions in the body. We just want to minimize the damage they cause, but we can't completely avoid this. Keep in mind there are other toxins that our bodies find tolerable. I said toxins and bunny ears, you didn't see that. Our bodies might even find them helpful up to a certain amount. So these include certain vitamins, minerals, and hormones. These things only become toxic when levels climb too high. So liver detoxification. There are 3 phases of detoxification, the first 2 of which occur in the liver. Phase 1 is the first stage of breaking down toxins and changing their form. After passing through stage 1, those broken down substances can be up to 60 times more toxic than the original substance. So phase 1 must immediately be followed by phase 2, so we don't have a lot of toxic intermediate metabolite crap hanging around causing damage. Phase 2 liver detoxification is also known as the conjugation pathway. So basically, with phase 2, the liver attaches another molecule to the intermediate toxin produced in phase 1 to render it less harmful. There are 6 types of conjugation that take place in this phase. On my blog, I go into it a little bit more, but I'll just mention the 3 that I'm going to talk about today. So that is sulfation, glucuronidation, and methylation. Once a substance has become detoxified, 2 things can happen. So first, the toxin is changed into a form that's fine to hang around in the body or even becomes useful in the body and is used again. Or the detoxified substance needs to exit the body via pooing, peeing, or sweating. So healthy bowel movements and regular sweating through exercise are really part of detoxification as well. So this is where we come back to the menstrual cycle, specifically the pre-ovulatory phase. Phase 1 and 2 liver detoxification as well as healthy bowel movements are super important during this phase for 2 reasons. Firstly, it prevents excess estrogen from building up. I go into more reasons on how and why that happens in my blog. Second reason is liver detoxification helps to metabolize medications. So remember, our body's still dealing with any medications we use during our period to deal with cramps, headaches, migraines, and back pain and that kind of stuff. So if you rely on aspirin or paracetamol to relieve the cramps or the headaches of PMS and menstruation, now is a good time to support phase 2 liver detoxification, to support glucuronidation, which 40 to 70% of all medications are metabolized by. And thirdly, another reason to support liver detoxification is to process caffeine. So premenstrually and menstrually, the low phases of our cycle, many women I see in clinic tend to consume more coffee and push through these stages so that they have energy. But there can be a price to pay, as I outline in another article that I link to in my blog. So rather than tell people to give up coffee altogether, which can make people very cranky with me, I focus on supporting liver detoxification. And acetylation is the conjugation pathway that primarily deals with caffeine metabolism, if anyone was really desperate to know that, which I doubt. So these are all reasons to support liver detoxification, especially phase 2 liver detoxification. So what are the foods that support phase 2 liver detoxification? Firstly, protein. And we want to do this, again, to remind you to support estrogen clearance. Protein, this one is huge. It's another reason why juice cleansers don't actually support liver detoxification. We need the amino acids from protein for liver detox to work, specifically the sulfur-containing amino acids, so cysteine, methionine, and taurine. They are all important for sulfation. This can be done through eating protein-containing foods in your diet, obviously. So, protein-containing foods. I'm not going to go into that here because I've got too much other stuff to say. You can Google it. Or You can also use more targeted support with, say, NAC or glutathione, but I won't go into that too much right now. Other ways to support phase 2 liver detoxification is eating carbohydrates. Surprise, surprise. Carbohydrates assist with detox pathways, which is another reason not to go keto. Yay. Low carb and low calorie diets generally don't provide enough carbs for the liver to function as an organ of detoxification. Plus, these diets suck. We can also have more sulfur-rich foods like cruciferous vegetables, so your broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, that kind of thing, the infamous kale. Also, allium veggies like garlic and onions, eggs and meat. The sulfur compounds in all these foods induce enzyme reactions in the liver, which can assist in detoxification. There's a few minerals that can help here: magnesium, calcium, zinc, copper, iron. Epsom salt baths are a good way to support the sulfation and pathway for people who don't tolerate sulfate-rich foods in their diet. Going out in the sun, which stimulates the production of cholesterol sulfate. There are foods and supplements, containing resveratrol, curcumin, D-limonene, and quercetin. All these things can induce enzymes that are needed for glucuronidation. You'll find them in grapes, turmeric, citrus and their peels, apples, berries, and green tea. Any supplement that inhibits beta-glucuronidase, which I'll talk about in a sec, so calcium D-glucarate, probiotics and prebiotics. What else? Herbal teas such as dandelion, rooibos, and rosemary tea. And astaxanthin, which you'll find in algae, yeast, trout, shrimp, and a few other things. Again, all on my blog. All of these foods, herbs, and supplements will help your body to metabolize and eliminate excess estrogen, as well as break down and safely excrete medications and coffee excesses. All right, finally, we're at number 5. Poo at least once a day. And yes, I am still talking about estrogen and about clearing it from your body. So after estrogens circulate in the blood and do their thing, your liver, and those estrogens can come from the environment or they can be produced in your ovary or elsewhere. But once they circulate in your blood, your liver dutifully metabolizes and conjugates estrogens. And then those estrogens get transported to the kidney for release via your urine or to the bile, where they move into the intestine and are pooed out. But one thing I haven't mentioned yet is the enterohepatic circulation of estrogens. So once they're in your colon, remember they've been metabolized by the liver, spat out into the bile, they get into the colon. Those conjugated estrogens may be acted on by an enzyme called beta-glucuronidase. This enzyme comes from bacteria and it's a bit naughty. It has the capacity to send those estrogens that have already been conjugated back into the portal system, back to the liver. In fact, around 80% of conjugated estrogens are reabsorbed for further metabolism in the liver. That sounds exhausting, doesn't it? And it is if your bowel isn't able to sweep some of those estrogens along when it has the chance before they're sent back to the liver. So if your bowel is sluggish, if you don't eat much fiber, or you don't drink much water, or your colonic bacterial balance is out, you might reabsorb more estrogen than you should. And this can exacerbate all those excess estrogen issues I mentioned before. The good news is a high fiber diet improves estrogen clearance from the gut. It does this by reducing colonic transit time, which affects the amount of estrogen that's deconjugated and reabsorbed. It also has some other neat little tricks having this high fiber diet. So it can actually alter the pH of your bowel in such a way that positively shifts the colonic microflora to reduce the activity of that pesky little enzyme, that beta-glucuronidase, that enzyme that sends estrogen back to the liver. So the liver has to keep working to try to get rid of it. So the result of a high fiber diet is more estrogen gets pooed out, blood levels of estrogen go down, and that equals less yucky, too high estrogen symptoms to fuck up your day. I will make a mention of the fact that if you are eating too much fiber, you can actually poo out too much estrogen and experience estrogen deficiency. And this can happen people with eating disorders or disordered eating who are just eating way too many salads and veggies and so-called healthy food. And The estrogen might already be low from under eating and over exercising, and then they're eating shitloads of fiber and they're pooing out all this excess estrogen that they actually really need to be holding on to. So just a caveat there to be mindful of. Fiber, in case you don't know, is found in plant foods like vegetables, fruit, whole grain foods, legumes, nuts, and seeds. So as long as you're eating plenty of those, getting enough hydration, and getting enough calories overall to fuel that peristaltic, the muscular activity of the bowel, you should be right as rain in the poo department. Hint or tip 6. This is the last one. Tip 6 is listen to your body. Again, yes, I know I said this in the last podcast episode talking about the menstrual phase, but it's that important. So I'm going to talk a little bit about energetics here. A few authors on this subject will provide lists of foods, very specific lists of foods that you should eat in each phase of your cycle. Oftentimes these lists are based on traditional Chinese medicine or Ayurvedic medicine or some kind of elemental or seasonal model. And I'm not dissing this stuff. I love this stuff. I can see the wisdom in it. In fact, I pay pretty close attention to my inner spring, my pre-ovulatory phase. I pay attention to whether my Vata or Pitta doshas are out of balance. I pay attention to whether I'm feeling more yang, extroverted, or yin, introverted at different stages of my cycle. But above all, I think it's more important to eat intuitively than to follow lists of foods that you should be eating in each phase of your cycle. I'm not going to end there, don't worry. I know many of you won't be satisfied with just eat intuitively. So I'll just say this about the pre-ovulatory phase. This phase corresponds in Chinese medicine and Ayurveda with an inner spring. It's the time to wake up from the relative stillness of menstruation. Remember that deep, sleepy yin time of a metaphorical winter. It's a time to burst up and out and shake up the stagnation. That's what springtime's all about. Spring's a season when when I tend to gravitate towards green leafy veggies, sprouts, and fresh flavors like citrus. In Chinese medicine, the flavors associated with spring happen to be sour, and the primary yin organ is the liver, which thrives on bitters. After the stronger cravings and increased metabolism of the premenstrual and early menstrual phase, some women do feel drawn towards more sour, bitter, and watery foods. And in this case, it aligns with those ancient Asian philosophies. Now, you may crave a higher intake of fresh fruits and vegetables, raw leafy herbs, fresh and sour citrus flavors, and even lighter ways of cooking like steaming and sauteing during your pre-ovulatory phase, especially if you went hard on the heavy, slow-cooked stews or on kind of greasy takeaways during the low-energy, I don't give a fuck kind of premenstrual and menstrual phases. You may crave those foods. I know that I sometimes do, and that is very exciting and cool because it totally lines up with the Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic perspective on this whole inner spring thing and the elemental kind of side of things. And it also lines up with our physiology because, as I mentioned earlier, we can access carbohydrate stores better in this low hormone phase. So I like to think of it as getting away with enjoying more salads and raw veggies and light cooking methods. We can get away with that more because we can access our glycogen stores more easily, and we're not going to just starve to death and wither away if we, enjoy a salad or something like that, or a heap of veggies instead of a more stick to your bones kind of meal. And this increase maybe in fresh produce and sour and bitter tastes, as I said, it corresponds with the nutritional science suggestions I've mentioned so far. So firstly, in eating lots of phytoestrogenic foods to balance estrogen, you will be focusing on lots of nutritious fruits and veggies. Secondly, in focusing on the foods that support liver and bowel detoxification, you'll be getting heaps of fiber. So, also lots of sour and bitter taste from citrus and brassicas and leafy greens and so on. So it all kind of lines up. And many a woman will find her appetite eases as her body's natural focus to storing and utilizing energy, which is what we tend to do in the premenstrual and menstrual phases, as that focus begins to shift. So there's an energetic adjustment that I think goes on. And it can absolutely relate to Chinese medicine and TCM. And it's also not something I want you to tie your knickers in a knot over. If you are not sure what you crave in this phase of your cycle, but you're up for experimenting, check in. Take note. See if you are starting to crave some of these kinds of foods. And if you want to try some of these foods and see if you like them, I'd say keep it simple and gentle. So you can incorporate some raw salads if it's not too cold. You could add some sprouts or some spinach or shredded kale to cook soups and stews just before serving. You could squeeze lemon juice over stuff. And if you enjoy them, sure, you could try adding the odd freshly pressed vegetable juice in just for fun. But, also if you feel like descending on a Big Mac, by all means, follow your appetite and enjoy the shit out of it. So this, as I said, is the second in a series of 5 where I explore the phases of the menstrual cycle and how to best honor them using nutrition. Coming up will be part 3, Nourishing Your Ovulatory Phase. I never know how I'm going to go because I'm researching and writing these blogs and articles as I go along. And this one was fucking huge. Like, I'm at the end of it now, but as you can see, if you've listened all the way to the end, part 2 was a big one. So thank you if you have listened all the way to the end. I hope that this has provided some useful information for you. And as I mentioned, if you're a Patreon, you get the bonus with a little bit more of the esoteric stuff. And if you want that, go to patreon.com/nondietyogi. Other than that, I am out of here to watch The Handmaid's Tale. Yay! Sending you lots of love. Thank you for being here. And extra big thanks to my Patreon champs who support the podcast. I will chat to you next time. Bye.